So, here's Logan. This is for Logan a little bit. We're in the midst of this series of Dharma talks and things I've been doing based on suggestions that folks provided, and this is, Logan's been waiting for this one for a while, so it's an appropriate topic for him to have been waiting for a while for me to talk about. Sean's next. I owe Sean one now. I don't remember off the top of my head what you wanted, but I've got the email. I'll figure it. So that'll be next. Logan wanted me to talk about patience. So the first thing I have to say about this, I got to be up front. Me doing a talk about patience is a little bit like asking Snoop Dogg and Willie Nelson to extol the virtues of temperance and sobriety, which is not natural. So I'm talking to myself with this one as much as I'm talking to anybody else, for sure. And there's developed into kind of a theme with these talks in the sense that the suggestions that I've gotten are for topics that are a little piece of a bigger thing, right? That there's a kind of a complex of larger ideas that it's a part of. Like I did a talk about right speech, and speech is a part of the Eightfold Path. So it kind of makes sense to have that context of the Eightfold Path and talk about speech. So patience is a part of what are called the paramitas, right? So I need to kind of talk about that idea, and then we'll drill down to specifically the topic of patience. So first of all, paramita. We just used that word a few minutes ago, right? It's right in the one of the chants that we did earlier in the Heart Sutra. Prajna paramita, right? Perfection of wisdom. Prajna means wisdom. Paramita means perfection. So the paramitas refers to a list, because Buddhists love lists, of perfections. In other words, they're qualities, right? Qualities that we should be trying to perfect, aspire to in our lives to live a worthy life, to live a good life, a holy life. And actually, there's an interesting parallel between the Eightfold Path that we talked about in the context of speech and then the paramitas. If you think about, they're both lists of things that we should be striving to develop in ourselves. The Eightfold Path is a list of kind of external, obvious things, behavioral things, right? They're behaviors. Our attitudes about our world, our behaviors in the world, right? Speech, right? Livelihood, things like that. So it's like doing, right? They're more doing, more external. The paramitas, on the other hand, are more internal, right? They're a list of attributes. They're aspects of our character, right? So character development is what we're talking about. There's this interesting book. Dale Wright has written this book called The Six Perfections, Buddhism, and the Cultivation of Character, right? So in that book, this is something he says in that book. From the early beginnings of their tradition, Buddhists have maintained that nothing is more important than developing the freedom implied in their activity of self-cultivation. That's the term that he uses, self-cultivation, of deliberately shaping the kind of life you will live. It is, they claim, our freedom available to no other beings in the universe. Wright goes on to point out that in the kind of the grand project of enlightenment, the perfections are both the means and the end. The training up in these character traits is the way by which enlightenment is achieved, and the cultivation of them is evidence of enlightenment being achieved, and the fact that we're able to do that is evidence of the enlightenment that we kind of already have. That's the idea. It's an otherwise excellent book, but at one point he makes a statement that I profoundly disagree with, and let me tell you what it was and why. So he writes this: Buddhists maintain that the beneficiary of your practice of self-cultivation is not just you, but others around you, and ultimately the whole of humanity. Now, the reason I disagree with that, my objection to that claim, is that it's entirely too small, right? Because first and foremost, the benefit of our practice accrues to all sentient beings, as the phrase goes in Buddhism, in the 3 times and the 6 directions, humanity is just a very small part of that. So if we're focusing just on I practice for the benefit of humanity, then we're selling ourselves short in terms of what the purpose of our practice is. The ironic thing, if you think about it from a Buddhist point of view, the ironic thing about this whole self-cultivation thing from a Buddhist perspective is that through the development of these character traits, we actually undermine the whole idea of a self in the first place, right? By the time we might truly perfect these qualities, the whole notion of a self would be revealed as the construction and illusion that it is, so that ultimately self-cultivation becomes self-deconstruction. You know, that's just because this is all a creation in our head in the first place. According to a book I probably look at way more than I should, Buswell and Lopez in the Encyclopedia of Buddhism, which is one of the biggest, fattest books that's up there on the bookshelf. They say paramita, while it literally means perfection, as I said, the way they actually define it is, it's the Sanskrit word for a virtue or quality developed and practiced by a bodhisattva, a being on the path to enlightenment, on the path to becoming a Buddha. There's one thing that makes it a little bit confusing, which is that there's another list in the Theravada tradition of Southern Asia. They have their own version of this. They have their own list, what they call the paramis, not the paramitas, the paramis. That's the Pali word, the same equivalent Pali word, the paramis. It's a list, it's a longer list. Most of what's on the list I'm about to talk about is on their list too, but they have a little bit longer list. So I'm going to focus on the 6 paramitas according to the Mahayana tradition, the kind of North Asian version of Buddhism, that the Korean tradition that the lineage here is in. Patience, or something very close to patience, is part of that list. And actually, if you've been here for a full moon service, you've already heard this list. You've got some familiarity with this list because there's a liturgy that's a part of the full moon service that actually goes through that list. It's called Meditation on the 6 Paramitas. Dana Paramita, may I be generous and helpful. Shila Paramita, may I be pure and virtuous. Kshanti Paramita, may I be patient, may I be able to bear and forbear the wrongs of others. Virya Paramita, may I be strenuous, energetic, and persevering. Dhyana Paramita, may I practice meditation and attain concentration and oneness to serve all beings. Prajna Paramita, may I gain wisdom and be able to give the benefit of my wisdom to others. Right, so that's the list. Let me kind of look at each of those, a little more detail. So we'll start at the top. And they're in this order for a reason. There's kind of a developmental process that's perceived as the reason why they're in this order. So first of all, dana, giving, generosity, charity. Sometimes it's translated charity. The tradition often portrays this as this is the virtue that's the foundation for practice for lay people, according to the tradition, with a focus on the merit that's gained by being generous with and unattached to material things. The perfection of that giving, dana paramita, posi balamir, that's the Korean, posi balamir. This is seen as, there's this idea of, in the development of a bodhisattva, there's 10 stages, right? The idea there's 10 stages in the development of a bodhisattva. And the perfection of giving, of dana, is associated with the first stage. So this is the beginning. This is the reason why they're in this order, right? This is the beginning of the foundation for kind of lay practice. So that's the first one. Shila, morality. Primarily, that means restraining actions and words that are non-virtuous. In the Mahayana tradition, again, in the North Asian Buddhist tradition, morality is seen as having there's 3 aspects to morality. The first one, for you guys who are working on the precepts, the first one's the precepts, right? Those kind of restraining precepts. don't take life, don't steal, those sorts of things. So that's the first one. The second one is accumulating wholesome qualities in our character. So that's kind of the whole thing that we're talking about now. And then the third one is giving help and support to all sentient beings. So those three things together kind of is what constitutes morality. So the perfection of that virtue, Shila Paramita, Kye Balamil, that's the Korean, Kye Balamil. That's associated with the second stage on this path to being a bodhisattva. So we start with giving, and then we go to morality. The third one is Kshanti. That's the one that goes with patience. I'll come back to the third one. We'll talk about the third in more detail. The fourth one, Virya. Virya comes from the word like for virile. That's where we get our word virile from. Virya means energy, effort, enthusiastically performing virtuous acts without becoming discouraged. Right? So the perfection of this energy, this vigor, Virya Paramita, Chongjin Balamil, that's the Korean for that, Chongjin Balamil, is associated with the fourth stage of that bodhisattva path, where the inexhaustible energy that's required for reaching enlightenment is achieved. The person sort of maximizes that energy. Dhyana. Dhyana means meditative absorption, right? The state of mind in which attention is so focused on the internal object of meditation, like the breath, that it becomes kind of fully detached from the external world of the senses. So this state, being in this state, temporarily protects the practitioner from the hindrances to furthering their development, their spiritual development in their practice. So the perfection of this state of mind, dhyana paramita, chongnyo baramil in Korean, this goes with the fifth stage. Again, we've got this 10-stage process. So that goes with the fifth stage of development. And then finally, we have the one we talked about earlier, prajna, right? Wisdom, awareness, understanding the reality of things as they truly are in the kind of deepest, purest, most accurate possible way. Prajna is Manjushri's sharp sword, right? That cuts through our ignorance. Prajna paramita, the perfection of wisdom, panya balamil, that's the Korean, panya balamil. This refers to the wisdom that leads to Buddhahood. So that's associated with the sixth stage of this bodhisattva path. And the idea being you get to that sixth stage and sort of then you're sort of in perpetual motion. You're on an unavoidable trajectory toward Buddhahood. There's still work to do, but it's inevitable that it's going to happen. So that's the whole list. And actually, some of those terms are used in other ways, meaning related to other things on multiple lists of different sorts. I told you last week, Buddhists love lists. Can't get enough lists. So let me, now that you kind of know the context, let's go back to that third one, right? The one that has to do with patience. Let's dig into that a little bit more deeply. Kshanti. It's a really funny word in Sanskrit. It looks like it's missing a vowel. Kshanti. Inyok, the Korean word's easier. Inyok. Inyok's the Korean word. It's translated in several different but related ways. Patience, steadfastness, endurance, forbearance, acceptance, tolerance. Our patriarch, Jonmei Kunsanim, who's written, many years ago, he wrote a dictionary. There's a copy of it up there too. He wrote a Buddhist dictionary. One of the definitions that he gives for kshanti inyok is to put up with, right? We need to learn to put up with things. That's part of what it implies. So similarly, the idea includes several different interpretations that have to do with the kind of the virtues of a bodhisattva, the virtues of being on the path to enlightenment. A bodhisattva should be able to bear abuse from other sentient beings. Abuse of the body, abuse of the ego. A bodhisattva should be willing to tolerate all manner of hardships without losing commitment to the path toward Buddhahood. A bodhisattva should be willing to face and accept the true nature of existence with equanimity, without being overwhelmed or losing heart, losing energy, losing motivation. So this represents a preliminary kind of shallow level of acceptance of the truth of suffering, right? As in the Four Noble Truths, right? The first of which is dukkha, right? Suffering, as dissatisfaction is a sort of an inherent part of life, unavoidable part of life. So in that sense, Kshanti Paramita, the perfection of this patience, Inyopalamil, this is the sign of achieving the third stage on the Bodhisattva path. Again, we're back to the 10 stages, so this is the third one. We can connect, I referred to it a minute ago, we can take this idea of Kshanti, of patience, if you want to use that word, and we can connect it right back to the most basic Buddhist idea, right? The reality of dukkha, the reality of that suffering, dissatisfaction. Suffering and dissatisfaction is unavoidable. That's just it. That's reality. No matter who we are, everything will not go our way all the time. That's just life, right? That's just the way it is. Hardship is inevitable. When hardship happens and the cause is something we can overcome, then we need the patience to overcome it, to solve the problem, right? To deal with it and overcome it. When the cause of hardship is not something that we can overcome, then we need the tolerance to accept it and deal with it. So either way, getting in a tizzy about it is not helpful at all, right? It's basically the Buddhist equivalent of crying over spilled milk. Right? If you can't fix the problem, don't sweat the problem, is kind of the idea. Wright, in that book I was talking about earlier, Wright also points out that this kshanti, this patience, is essential to dealing with ourselves when we have the tendency toward destructive emotional reactions to other people in terms of how we relate to others. Intolerance of other people and patience with other people is often the trigger, right, for aversive emotions, for emotional states that we don't like. Anger, frustration, those kinds of emotional states to arise. It can be helpful when we feel those kinds of emotions starting to arise towards someone to instead try to kind of turn it around in our minds. Imagine that person as our teacher, right? Rather than being, this person is a pain in my butt. This person is so frustrating. To instead try to think of it as, let me be grateful to this teacher who's giving me the opportunity here through their actions to help me develop kshanti, to help me develop tolerance, to develop patience. I was just this morning, I was reminded of this very, very distinctly, very strongly, taking my elderly mother to go do her grocery shopping this morning, a task that's become kind of progressively more difficult and challenging to deal with over time. I've had to remind myself of that. This is a lesson. This is an opportunity for growth. Going beyond that sort of everyday experience, Wright quotes from the Dalai Lama at one point, who wrote, "Those who would harm us give us unparalleled opportunity to practice disciplined behavior." Now, all of that being said, it's also true that there are limits on what should be tolerated, right? Kshanti doesn't mean accepting mistreatment or cruelty to an infinite degree. That's not what it means. As Wright puts it, the perfection of tolerance is the art of understanding what, when, and how to tolerate. Rather than a form of surrender in life, tolerance must be underwritten by exuberant compassion and a commitment to noble values. Perfect tolerance finds the appropriate middle ground, Buddhism, right? Middle ground between self-obsessive intolerance and self-inflicted humiliation, right? So neither one of those is healthy, obviously, right? So Shanti is, we're back to the middle path again, right? There's one sense in which accepting mistreatment from another person without limit is actually destructive to that person. In a sense, you're not kind of doing that person a favor by letting them get away with taking advantage or being mistreating or anything like that. Since through those actions, that person is going to continue to accumulate negative karma, that they're not going to have the opportunity to kind of see the error of their ways and begin to tolerate or begin to cultivate their own character, right? So in a sense, by letting somebody get away with stuff, so to speak, you're setting them up to have bad outcomes in kind of the existential sense by not having the opportunity to sort of get on the right path themselves. There's another character trait that kind of runs parallel to tolerance, and that's humility, right? Often an intolerant or impatient response to an experience, to a situation, usually, maybe aimed at some other person, is rooted in a sense that we don't deserve the noxious thing that's happening to us, right? That we're too important, we're too respectable, we're too superior, maybe in comparison to the person whom we see as the root of our problem, the root cause of the experience that we're having. So that kind of arrogance, privilege, entitlement, obviously that's not compatible with kind of a true kind of tolerance. It may kind of come with something that looks like tolerance, kind of a fake kind of tolerance, that's really more kind of a looking down your nose at paternalism, holier than thou kind of attitude, kind of thing. I think probably, to wrap this up, the most useful thing I can probably say about the development of this Kshanti in yoga is it's hard. So be patient. I know, be patient about being patient. I know, it's so meta, I know. But not too patient, right? Don't be too patient about being patient, because you need to be reasonable with yourself, but you can't just let yourself off the hook, right? You can't completely let yourself off the hook. If there's no difference between self and other, then we need to try to be patient with impatience. In other people, you'd be patient with other people's impatience. But if there's no difference between self and other, then that means we got to be patient with our own impatience too, right? We can't be sort of overly harsh on ourselves, more so than we would be with anybody else. That's the hardest part, probably, because obviously we are our own closest target for our impatience, right? I don't know about you. The main person that suffers from my impatience is me, right? So, because it's a lot easier to get away with being impatient with being intolerant of yourself, because if it's all happening in here, nobody else may even know about it, right? But on the other hand, though, if we spend too much time practicing intolerance and impatience in here, it makes it a lot easier to do it out there too. It just sort of becomes a habit, and it's harder to, it becomes so much easier to inflict it on other people as well. So that may be the hardest part of all. Sambhala Shipshio, may you and all beings manifest enlightenment.